You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi, and joining us from Washington, D.C. is Drake Long, an analyst with Radio Free Asia. A maritime analyst, especially really wanted it this time and day, especially because of what's really happening in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea before that. Just wanted to get your take, your perspective on what's happening between the Indian Navy and the U.S. Navy, the largest warship, supercarrier, USS Nimitz, other naval ships with the Indian Navy as they progress from their war games, from the South China Sea, from the Philippines Sea, through the Malacca Straits into the Indian Ocean. Now, how strong a significant message is that to China, to the region, to the world?
I would say it's extremely significant. You're seeing cooperation, a bilateral naval exercise between the Indian Navy and the U.S. Navy in a very sensitive area for China, right past the Malacca Strait, which is where most of their trade in oil goes through. I would say this is a significant signal from India to China that it is taking a much stronger stance on not just the Indian Ocean issue, but the South China Sea issue, by working with the U.S. aircraft carrier that was just, as you said, drilling in that area. So I would say it's definitely a very strong signal. I think it conveys to China, India is concerned about what China's doing in the maritime realm, and there's probably some other connections to that too. So I would say it's a very welcome development.
Yeah, those connections, of course, are what happened in the northern border with India, LAC. But these were passing exercises, as they call, with the U.S. Navy going on to the Persian Gulf, the Nimitz and its carrier group. But in the very recent past, we've had joint exercises that the Indian Navy has had with the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, with the French Navy. There is almost certainly going to be confirmation that Australia will be invited for the Malabar exercises, which is now the Quad. For the second time, I think Australia will be there. It hasn't been there because of China's concerns, I presume. So
Yes.
the signal that is, it's not just one Navy that's operating or sending out these signals, however strong they are, the US itself, individually, but collectively, what does that mean for Beijing?
Well, it's exactly what you said. If you look at India performs an exercise with Japan, India performs an exercise with France, but while the USS Nimitz was in the South China Sea, the US also performed a drill with Japan, and before that, the US and Australia had a bilateral naval exercise. So it's just as you said, if you're in Beijing, you're looking at the Quad. The Quad is exercising more together. They are taking a common line on issues like the South China Sea, or at least they're paving over some of their bigger differences. And like, as you said, Australia is going to be in the Malabar exercise. That's a huge area of concern for China. It's essentially confirming their worst fears that the Quad is becoming a functional grouping. There are perennial issues in China. They're very concerned about things like encirclement, engagement, some would say. They don't want too many allies ganging up against them or hedging against them. And if you're looking at this rapid pace of military and naval exercises between all the Quad members and some other outside members and US partners and Indian partners, the only conclusion that you can come to is that your behavior has actually accelerated that encirclement.
That behavior has exaggerated, or the momentum has shifted in terms of encirclement, or however you want to put it there. But will that actually change China, Beijing, the Communist Party, the PLA navies' actual behavior, say, in the South China Sea, or are they going to be as blasé as they have been in the past?
It's very unlikely it'll actually change China's behavior too much. In response to the dual carrier exercises that the U.S. did in the South China Sea last week, China actually launched a live-fire maritime naval air exercise. That's a lot to say, but an air exercise in Hainan province. And they practiced with anti-ship fighter bombers. So it's sort of a tit-for-tat response of you exercise, we'll exercise. It's not necessarily going to moderate China's behavior. You will see China act perhaps a little bit more recklessly as they search for options to respond. But fundamentally, China views the South China Sea as its near seas. It views it as an intrinsic part of its territory. And to most people, that might seem absurd. But when you lay down in your maritime strategy for years upon years that this broad, massive swath of the ocean is your near seas, important for your territorial integrity, then that means that the only thing that you can do is basically hyperventilate. You can think harder about how to protect and securitize that area. And that is what led China to take a more harder line in the Eastern Indian Ocean and in the South Pacific.
I'll just come to these historical claims, and you've done a lot of work on that, and it'll be interesting to hear your views on that. But when we're talking about the latest Passex, the passing exercises that are taking place between the US Navy and the Indian Navy, now they are close to, or may not exactly be near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are a group of islands which are crucially placed, the 6 and the 10-degree channels, to take any possible action during conflict, or when you have to send a message to China about its exports, its imports, its trade via sea, its oil, energy. That's a huge juggler there. Uh, the India has been over the years ramping up both its civil infrastructure as well as its military infrastructure, and it's a actually a quad command there: the Navy, Air Force, the Army, and the Coast Guard. The crucial strategic points where the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are. Now, for China, when it comes from the PLA Navy from the South China Sea, and we know it goes all the way through the Indian Ocean up to the Horn to Djibouti as well. Now,
Yes.
how crucial in your aspect is the placement of those islands strategically, and India ramping up its infrastructure there as well?
I would say they're actually extremely well placed strategically. I think that they are actually something that China is thinking about quite a lot. If you look at the Malacca Strait, China has made a number of efforts through BRI deals or through maybe just its naval expansion to try to bypass the Malacca dilemma. They don't want to be reliant on the Malacca Strait forever. They want to find some way to keep it open in the case of a conflict. What India has done with the Andaman and Nicobar Command is it has essentially said, we know that this is an important area. We know this is very, very strategic for China's goals, and we also kind of know how to put the pressure on and show that we're not necessarily passive when it comes to China's own sort of, I mean, I don't want to say base building, but China's own efforts to create a string of pearls through the Indian Ocean all the way up to Djibouti. So I would say the Andaman and Nicobar Island Command is actually extremely important for how India and China sort of think about each other and think about the worst case scenario going forward.
And both the US carrier strike groups, the area which they came from, the drills that they conducted there, the signals that were sent with these joint exercises with Japan, as you're pointing out, again with countries in the region now, India itself. How do you visualize China reacting to that? You did mention, of course, what is happening in terms of the live drills that they conducted themselves. But how
Yes.
do they respond to that, especially with diplomatic pressure as well? The U.S. Secretary of State has come out with, well, not a new position, but at least legally confirming what the U.S. position is vis-a-vis Chinese claims in the South China Sea. So when you look at, yes, there is a concerted, maybe coordinated effort to send out a message. How do you visualize Beijing reacting to that?
So China's paramount, or Beijing's paramount goal right now is to try to peel off as many members of what they think are part of this encirclement as possible. So what you're seeing right now, as you said, the U.S. didn't necessarily change its position a lot last week, but they did make a crucial distinction between China's efforts to harass Southeast Asian countries in terms of their exclusive economic zones, and said, we will be defending or at least protecting Southeast Asian countries on these resources, saying, this is the livelihood of their coastal communities, this is the inheritance of their children and grandchildren, stuff like that. So what has China done? I mean, I can tell you right now, China's going to be sending out more survey ships. They're going to be sending out more Coast Guard vessels to try to pressure Southeast Asian countries in their economic zones, in their maritime entitlements, to show them that when that pressure comes, the USA will not show up. There was one way to look at the various things China has done in the South China Sea lately. One way to look at it is to take advantage of what many people assumed would cripple the US's readiness in that area, the COVID-19 pandemic. And by stepping up the pressure at that time, they're showing allies, look, when you need the USA, it's not going to be there. So I think China is going to put forward a lot of, maybe not necessarily aggressive, but definitely provocative measures to try to show different individual countries, middle powers, Southeast Asian states, probably most likely India, that it can't count on the US or the Quad to necessarily come to the rescue. Or there could be diplomatic or economic inducements. It's something we'll have to watch and see.
When you were talking about the survey ships, India has also been concerned of late about Chinese presence.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at the playbook that China has used in the South China Sea, you have survey ships surrounded by Coast Guard vessels going in the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia or the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam within 200 nautical miles of their coast. And the whole point of that is to simply show that, look, we can do this, and because it's a survey ship, it's a civilian vessel, so they have, a little bit plausible deniability. It's not a warship. You can't really escalate against us that much. The fear is that that playbook in the South China Sea will be extended to the Indian Ocean. And we've seen Chinese survey ships and what were accused of being Chinese surveillance ships in the Indian Ocean not too long ago. So I think it's a very real concern, not just for India, but for also other countries that call the Indian Ocean home. It's something they have to think about as China kind of rolls out the strategy across the South China Sea and encounters a lot of, maybe not success, but mixed success, or at least a lack of a strong response.
You were talking about the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, and we did see that even when the Malaysian airliner disappeared, and they used that as the excuse to search for it, and we knew
Right. Yeah.
they were actually surveillance. A little bit more on the South China Sea itself and Beijing's so-called historic claims, and we've seen now that there is so much. There's a microscope on China's behavior all across that people around the world are recognizing what it's been doing in various spheres. And the South China Sea is one of them. And these claims, whether they are so-called islands, which are actually underwater, the reefs,
Yeah.
they're part of UNCLOS. So,
Yep.
but they will not abide by rulings that are made, say, against them in the Philippines case. So,
Right.
on one hand, they're saying that we are part of the international order, rules-based order, so as to speak. The US hasn't ratified UNCLOS for that matter,
That's a
but
good point.
but when it comes to rulings, they can still, or they still think they have the power or the necessity to do whatever they actually want. So use the rules when they want to and do what they want to anyway.
They use the rules to call out what they view as the hypocrisy of countries like the USA, which, as you said, hasn't ratified UNCLOS. However, they're never really going to follow the letter of the law when it comes to the UNCLOS Law of the Sea or the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration Award that ruled against China's claims in that case that the Philippines brought. So China will basically ignore it. And I believe that when the 2016 ruling came out, which set a huge precedent for the South China Sea, China just said, it's just a piece of paper. We don't really care. China is right now negotiating with Southeast Asian states, including some like-minded partners of India, about the code of conduct that would govern behaviors in the South China Sea. And while they're negotiating, China has been stepping up these provocative surveys, intruding in people's economic rights. So it really calls into question their sincerity of when they do cite international law, or when they do talk about negotiating peaceably about these issues.
I just wanted to talk about another fear that had been raised even before the current situation, which is what China did in 2013 in the East China Sea when it declared the air defense identification zone. Now, the Americans will still travel through that over the years, but it's much more significant if they do that in the South China Sea.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, you had the statement last week from India's Ministry of External Affairs saying, we want freedom of overflight in the South China Sea. Go back a little bit further, at the 36th ASEAN Summit, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you said, we want freedom of overflight. The US has said, we want freedom of overflight. They're all saying this because there are persistent rumors that China would declare what's called an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea. Declaring an ADIZ over the East China Sea is one thing, but the South China Sea, just the southern portion, is nearly half the size of the continental United States. You cannot realistically enforce an air defense identification zone over that large of an area, and to do so, you are demanding that the air forces and the commercial planes of 6, 7 different countries all adhere to it. It just seems absurd enough that it's something that China might actually consider doing just to assert its jurisdiction over the area. It's fundamentally about asserting jurisdiction. But you have this phrase, freedom of overflight, that keeps popping up, that I think sends a very strong signal that even for countries very reticent to criticize China by themselves, they're saying this is a step too far. Do not declare an ADIZ over the South China Sea. That's too much.
Jake Long, absolute pleasure having you on StratNews Global, and we hope to share with you your insights in the future as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for all our viewers, just a reminder to get all the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective on our website, StratNews Global. You can also follow us on our social media Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook handles, and just click on that bell icon on our YouTube channel if you want to get live notifications or reminders of videos that we put up like this one. You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh P.